Hello, my name is Vincent Anderson, and I am currently a student within the Masters of Sociology program at Arizona State University. I have chosen to research and draw attention to the racial discrimination that is endured by African American youths on a daily basis within the American education system. I want to approach the matter in four different sections. First, I want to explain to you what racial discrimination is and what it consists of. Secondly, I would like to discuss the effects that occur within African American students from the actual presence of racial discrimination. Thirdly, I want to touch on the current ineffective approaches that I believe are being utilized uh, within the American education system to combat racial discrimination. And lastly, I would love to present to you a few solutions that I believe would be very effective in not only helping to reduce the presence of racial discrimination, but hopefully one day lead to the eradication of racial discrimination that is endured not only by African American youth within the American education system, but by all children within the American education system. What is racial discrimination? Well, according to humanrights.gov, racial discrimination occurs when a person is treated less favorably than another person in a similar situation because of their race, color, descent, national or ethnic origin, or immigrant status. Now, exactly how prevalent is racial discrimination occurring within American schools? Well, according to Seaton and Douglas, over a 2 week time frame, while visiting multiple American schools, an astounding 97% of black students reported having experienced at least one incident of racial discrimination. Now, as you can see, racial discrimination can be broken down into three separate categories, starting with individual. Now, an example of individual racism or individual racial discrimination experienced by African American students occurred whenever students of European American descent treated African American students as if they were stupid or they needed things explained to them slowly or several times. Cultural racism that would may have been experienced by the African American students within the actual classroom would typically occur maybe from current event articles that students had to read within class, or whenever students read history books, and with those current event articles or within history books, there is very seldom opportunity for African American students to hear of good news or good things pertaining to individuals of their culture. Lastly, we have collective or what would be described as institutional racism or racial discrimination within institutions. Basically, an example of that occurred whenever African American students felt that they did not receive a particular award because they were of African American descent. Next, we will be transitioning into the issues and concerns section, which ultimately affects the overall self image of African American students. The effects of racial discrimination towards African American students has caused several psychological and social issues such as depression, anxiety, and the presence of low self esteem. Now, if we look at adolescence, it represents a vital time in every child's life for them to discover exactly who they are. And that time period, it holds great importance in developing a self identity that is shaped and molded by their emotional and psychological support systems, academic environments, and their historical and cultural backgrounds. As African American youths work their way through their stages of adolescence, it seems highly unfair that they are subjected to racially biased behaviors that cause them to slip into stages of depression and anxiety. It is truly vital for all youths of any culture or race to feel important and valued within their respective communities. While enduring racial discrimination within an academic environment, it's very difficult for African American students to not develop a negative mindset that convinces them to believe that they aren't equally valued members of their academic community. As a result of that, many African American students may begin to develop an outsider's mentality that could possibly cause them to spend more time focusing on enduring the negative effects of racial discrimination as opposed to focusing on their academics so that they can ensure that they are extremely successful within their classes and courses. Here we have another issue which is extremely concerning, and that is the presence of a racially biased curriculum that exists within the American education system. Before us, we have pictures of two individuals. On the left hand side, we have the great European inventor Thomas Edison, who is credited with inventing the light bulb. On the right hand side, we have an unidentified African American gentleman. This African American gentleman is Lewis Latimer. Lewis Latimer was a very vital member of Thomas Edison's team as it pertains to inventing the light bulb. Lewis Latimer is credited with inventing the filament that exists within the light bulb, which causes the light bulb to last much longer than just a few days. Some could argue without Latimer's contribution to the light bulb that the light bulb could very well be an obsolete object that could have been bypassed for another source of artificial lighting. Now, the omission of Lewis Latimer's contribution to the light bulb within the history books that are being utilized within the American education system show a blatant disrespect for a great African American inventor, and it shows clear bias to European American inventors, which can lead to a lower self image for African American children who fail to see the contributions of those before them who look like them, who have contributed to the positive advancement of American culture that we all enjoy today. Next, we're going to get into some current and effective approaches as it relates to resolving the issues of racial discrimination within the American education system. There are two current and effective approaches on this slide that I would first like to address. First and foremost, the most ineffective form of addressing the issue of racial discrimination within the education system is to avoid the actual opportunity to hold productive conversations regarding its presence. Now, if you look at a very notable scholar by the name of Tim Wise, he says that after all, acknowledging unfairness then calls decent people forth to correct those injustices. And since most persons are at their core decent folks, the need to ignore evidence of injustice is powerful. To do otherwise would force whites to either push for change, which they would perceive as against their interest, or live consciously as hypocrites who speak of freedom and opportunity, but perpetuate a system of inequality. Ultimately, it's going to take good and decent European Americans to come to the table to be willing to speak of the issues of racial discrimination within the American education system if there's ever to be any progress made. Secondly, a very ineffective approach is to deny the simple fact that racial discrimination even exists within the American education system. Unfortunately, there are individuals who opt to believe that African Americans speaking of the biases and the discrimination that exists within the American education system, they believe that they're only doing it because they want a handout or they want an easier road. When, as the evidence shows, that is not the case. Students are suffering from depression, anxiety, and low self-esteem, which contributes to a low self-image. And that is more than enough evidence for there to be important conversations held and to know that racial discrimination does exist within the American education system. The next ineffective approach that is often overly utilized within America is the notion of color blindness. The picture that we see before us, as I selected, I found it to be very subtle yet very profound, because it hits the nail on the head as it states that color blindness is not an actual thing. Recognizing that people have different lived experiences depending on skin tone is one way to combat white supremacy / racial discrimination. Now, as mentioned before, the notion of colorblindness is a poor way to address racism and racial discrimination because it strips identity from people of color and it implies that being white is normal. Although this approach is used by many individuals who have good intentions, it could be perceived as someone not actually wanting to acknowledge that racial discrimination does exist within the American education system. Lastly, I will offer you a few recommendations that I believe could prove to be very effective and successful with the reduction and ultimately the eradication of racial discrimination that is being experienced by African American students within the American education system. The first recommendation that I was certainly encouraged by was the actual thought of schools taking it upon themselves to promote healthier interracial environments. First and foremost, by way of social opportunities, next, teamwork, and lastly, safe spaces. The social opportunities are very key in the fact that we see schools traditionally have school dances and things of that nature, but in my experience, I've yet to experience a school encourage after-school social events that are enticing for not only African American students but also European American students, where they can all get amongst themselves and socialize and learn that they're not all so different from one another. Next is the thought of teamwork. When we think of teamwork naturally, especially with adolescents, sports is one of the first things that may come to mind. When we're talking about teamwork, schools can take it upon themselves to promote African American students to try other sports other than the proverbial football and basketball. I believe that it's something that could prove to be very beneficial as students attempt to expand and broaden their gaze and promote healthier teamwork relationships. Lastly, I believe that safe spaces are very important and very crucial and very much needed in this day and age. In regards to students having a space where they know that they can go and speak with not only administrators but also other students regarding issues of race or any racial tension that may be occurring. It's important for students to realize the importance of diversity in education and institutions take it upon themselves that students not only interact within the classroom but also outside of the classroom. Schools could find it very beneficial to encourage students to participate in those sports that they have never tried, as well as creating school club teams that attract a diverse group of students. School administrators are the responsible adults, and they are ultimately responsible for helping to create a racially diverse culture that breeds unity and teamwork among students. The next recommendation that I found to be very powerful was the discovery of Black history knowledge, penned by authors Chapman, Hilliard, and Adams Bass. What the aforementioned authors discovered was the fact that when African American students were faced with detrimental circumstances, such as racial discrimination, the African American students showed the ability to persevere and display positive fortitude whenever the youths were provided the necessary knowledge to challenge negative racially based ideas. Far too often, um, African American students are taught about slavery year in and year out within the American education system. If anyone does their own research, you will truly understand that African American history is much more rich and much more important than the days of slavery, and there is great history that precedes the days of slavery that are not touched upon. But whenever the positive contributions are touched upon and actually shared with African American students, it has proved to be very beneficial for them to combat racially charged stereotypes and things of that nature. Next, we have the notion of racial identity. Racial identity was basically utilized within a study as a protective factor against racial discrimination by author Sellers and his colleagues. Now, what their study results suggested was that the positive attitudes and beliefs that African American students felt toward their race may be extremely vital in preventing the onset of degrading feelings that would cause a low self image. So, not only is the historical context of great value and importance in building the self image of African American children, but also the positive current events that are going on within the African American communities across the country would prove to be very beneficial as well for African American students to identify positively with their race as opposed to the negative news and the negative stereotypes that are constantly being perpetuated and constantly being displayed day in and day out within America, particularly within the education system. Lastly, I want to address the recommendation of the critical race theory, which is comprised of five different sections. The first being counter storytelling, which basically helps to give a voice to the marginalized group of students, to where typically experiences are expressed or conveyed through the experience of European American students. And with the critical race theory, it aims to expose that and help the marginalized students, such as African American students, to have a voice as well on certain issues. Secondly, is the permanence of racism. Basically, it provides a notion that racism is a part of everyday American life, which does allow European American students to gain privilege over other students at their expense. Um, for an example, if we look at the discipline typically handed out in schools to African American students as opposed to European American students, this is something that the critical race theory aims to expose and shed light on. Thirdly, whiteness as property. Basically, which states that programs that are implemented within school programs to help European students to gain an advantage, such as gifted programs, which are specifically filled by European American students, which help to put them in a more advantageous position when being considered for scholarships, things of that nature. Fourth, we talk on the interest convergence, which the critical race theory aims to expose as well, such as a predominantly white school looking to recruit more African American students to boost maybe their football team or their basketball team's performance, or even if you look at some East Coast schools, to boost their lacrosse team's performance as well. Lastly, is the critique of liberalism. Basically, an example of that would be schools adding only the certain amount of black students, African American students needed to have the ability to say that they celebrate diversity. So the critical race theory, it's an invaluable tool that can be used to expose racism and racial disparities within the American education system, that does expose the notion that being white is the equivalent to being normal. So it can certainly help to be invaluable with helping African American students with exposing the issues that they face and drawing true light to them. To conclude this presentation, as you can see, there is a picture of the great late Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. As everyone knows, his famous "I Have a Dream" speech promoted true hope for racial equality within the American education system, amongst other things, wanting African American and European American children to have the opportunity to get along in peace and unity. And although that dream has partially come true, we still have a long way to go. And I do believe with the issues that were presented in regards to African American students experiencing racial discrimination within the American education system as a result of it, experiencing depression, anxiety, low self-esteem that helps to contribute to a low self-image. And with that being said, with the ineffective approaches that are currently being used, they need to be done away with, and to the forefront needs to be the solutions that were mentioned. This is something that can be achieved. I am very hopeful, and I am certainly going to do my part in this as well. Practice what I preach, and try to see if we can better our education systems to be equipped and equal and fair for all students, not just African American or European American students, but all students of every ethnic and cultural background. Thank you for your time.